Hi, y'all. See my thing back there? It's all frozen up. So it's really cold out here. I had to run the car for a few minutes to get it warmed up so that I could do this. I didn't leave the car running because that would just create a lot of noise on the video because I got the iPhone sitting kind of on the dashboard thing, and so it would create a lot of vibration. So anywho, I'm gonna make today short because it's cold. Um, I want to talk today about the ontological argument, or at least a couple of ontological arguments. This is not going to play a part in my overall case for Christianity because I don't necessarily think it's a good argument. It may be a sound argument, but it's not a good argument. I'll explain the distinction in a minute. But the main reason I wanted to talk about it is just because it's interesting. So there you have it. So like there have been a bunch of ontological arguments through the years. The first one, the earliest one, the one that everybody hears about in their freshman philosophy class, is Anselm's ontological argument. But since then, there's all kinds of arguments. Plantinga's got one of the most famous that's popular today. He uses modal logic and possible world semantics. There's also one by somebody named Maydole. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right. I've seen his, but I don't have it memorized. And there's a bunch of other ones. But I'm going to talk about Anselm's, and then I'll talk about Plantinga's. And I want to spend most of the time on Plantinga's argument. So Anselm's argument, I'm not 100% I understand it. I mean, every now and then I'll read it and I'll have this moment of lucidity in which I understand it, and it makes sense. But I don't think it's a sound argument, and there's a couple of reasons. First, let me tell you how I understand the argument. First of all, he defines God as a being for which you cannot conceive of a greater being. And so, obviously, a being that exists in real life is greater than a being that only exists in the understanding. So if you're trying to conceive of this being, then just the mere conceiving of it makes you realize that it can't just exist in your mind, because if it's just existing in your mind, then it's not the greatest conceivable being. Well, there's somebody standing right in front of me. It's making me so uncomfortable. All right, she's walking off. that was a little awkward. Okay, so if you're conceiving of this, or you're trying to conceive of the greatest conceivable being, and you start thinking, well, it only exists in my head, well, then you're not thinking of the greatest conceivable being. To think of the greatest conceivable being, you have to be thinking of the being that actually exists. And so just the mere concept of the greatest conceivable being implies that it exists in reality or something like that. Because if it didn't exist in reality, then the being you're thinking of is not the greatest conceivable being. I don't know. That was kind of muddy, I realize. So there are two things. I mean, he seems to be confusing conception with reality because, I mean, obviously anything that you're conceiving of is just a conception in your head. I mean, there's no reason, even if you're thinking of something existing, doesn't imply that it exists. I don't think you can just define something into existence that way. But the bigger problem is one that Immanuel Kant pointed out, which is that he's using existence as if it were a property. So you got properties like omnipotence, omniscience, all these great making properties, and then he just tacks on existence to it, as this existence is just another property that can be put alongside all these other properties. That strikes me as being a categorical mistake, because existence consists in having properties, and so it's a completely different category altogether. So I think that's the major thing. Existence is not a property. Plantinga's argument gets around this by not saying that existence is a property, but that saying necessity is a property, or necessary existence. Because a thing can exist and be contingent, or a thing can exist and be necessary. And so of those two things that exist, one contingent and one necessary, if they were equal in all other respects, then the necessary being would be a greater being. So if we consider so he's got two different definitions. You got maximal excellence on the one hand and maximal greatness on the other. Maximal excellence would be something that has all great making properties except for necessary existence. It's a contingent thing. So it's all powerful and all loving and all this great stuff. but it's not necessary. So a maximally great being is a being that has maximal excellence, but it has it in all possible worlds. So if there were just like, consider every possible world out there, there may be a whole bunch of them that have maximally excellent beings, but they only exist in those particular possible worlds. A maximally excellent or a maximally great being would have all those great making properties in every possible world, including the actual one. And so here's the argument. The argument begins with the premise that there is at least one possible world in which maximal greatness is instantiated. Well, if maximal greatness consists in having all great making properties in all possible worlds, well then, if it exists in one world, it exists in all possible worlds. And so it exists in the actual world. That's kind of the argument. That first premise may be true for all I know, but there's no non-question begging way to show that it's true. I mean, even Plantinga recognized this. In his book, God, Freedom, and Evil, he says nobody would accept this argument unless nobody would accept the first premise unless they already accepted the conclusion. And so he says that this argument doesn't establish the existence of God. What it establishes is the rational acceptability of God. Because although there's no way to prove that first premise, it is nevertheless a reasonable thing to believe. And if you believe that first premise, then logic is going to lead you to believe in God. I think that's reasonable. But here's the reason I don't think it's a good argument. Because consider the premise, there is a possible world in which maximal excellence or maximal greatness is not instantiated. Well, if there were just one possible world in which maximal greatness was not instantiated, then it couldn't be instantiated in any possible world, because if it were, then it would be in all possible worlds. So if you think about this, either one or two premises are true. Either there's a possible world in which maximal greatness is instantiated, or there's a possible world in which maximal greatness is not instantiated. If one of these is true, then the other is false. And if the other is true, then the other is false. You know what I'm saying. They can't both be true, because they both lead to contradictory conclusions. One leads to the conclusion that a necessary being exists, and the other leads to the conclusion that a necessary being does not exist, or a maximally great being does not exist. So either this maximally great being is necessary, or it's impossible. It's one or the other. There can't be like a contingent maximally great being, because that's a contradiction. So that's an interesting thing. Now, imagine trying to adjudicate between these two. If you assume one in order to argue that the other is false, well, you're begging the question. So you can't do that. The only thing you can do is look at both of them and say, well, neither one of them, or one of them doesn't seem like it's incoherent. And so if it doesn't seem incoherent, there's no obvious contradiction in the notion, then there must be a possible world in which that thing is so. But the problem is that seems to be the case with both of them. It's not hard to conceive of a world in which a maximally great being exists, but it's also not hard to conceive of a world in which a maximally great being does not exist. So our conceivability cannot help us here, can't help us adjudicate between these two views. So there's another way that people try to establish that first premise, and they do it by appealing to other theistic arguments. Well, the problem with doing that is twofold. For one, if you appeal to something like the Kalam cosmological argument or the moral argument, these arguments do not give you a necessary God, and so they don't give you any reason to think that there's a maximally great being. And so that's one problem. The other problem is if you did appeal to an argument that gave you a necessary being, like say you could use the argument from contingency and say that shows that there's a necessary being, and therefore, a maximally great being can exist. Well, the problem there is you're arguing in a circle, because you're trying to establish the existence of a necessary being. If you assume it, or if you get that God is necessary from another argument, and you use that in a premise in your ontological argument, and then conclude that therefore a necessary God exists, you're arguing in a circle. And so there's one other way to establish that first premise, and you can do it inductively. And somebody sent me an article that he had written. He hadn't published it yet, but he had written it, and he gave kind of an inductive case for why it's more probable than not that a maximally great being exists in at least one possible world. I don't remember what that argument is, or I'd tell you. I don't even remember what I thought about it when I read it. But the only reason I believe that the first premise is probably true is simply because I already subscribe to Christianity. You know, I've already bought the whole package and stuff, and so I suspect that premise is true, and therefore the conclusion is true. But that's not exactly a non-circular reason for establishing it. So I don't think, although I think that Alvin Plantinga's argument is probably sound because that first premise probably is true, I don't think it's a good argument because I don't think there's any non-question begging way to defend that first premise. So that's pretty much all I had to say about the ontological argument. I think I'm going to do one more argument or one more video in this series where I'm just going to kind of recap the conclusion of all these different arguments and talk about the degree to which it supports Christianity, if at all. And I've already mentioned that in the first video. I just kind of want to do a recap now that I've already gone through all the arguments. And then after that, that'll be it for all the philosophical stuff. Then I'll get into the historical stuff. And it'll be interesting to see how that goes. So thanks for coming.